All right, hello everybody. My name is Sammy, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. So I'll keep this short since I think we're a few minutes behind, and I want to give everyone as much time as possible to ask questions. So Dr. Alex Moore is currently finishing up a postdoctoral associate's position at the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. And they'll soon be heading to Vancouver to start as an assistant professor at the Forest and Conservation Science and Botany at the University of British Columbia. And Alex is actually from Ann Arbor. Alex is an alumni of the University of Michigan. They completed their undergraduate and master's degree here in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Alex earned their PhD in forestry and the environmental studies from Yale, where the research focused on macroinvertebrate food webs in New England and how predator-prey interactions influence the health and functioning of coastal salt marshes. Since earning their PhD, Alex's research has continued to focus on coastal systems and exploring the cultural impacts of habitat restoration and conservation in coastal ecosystems like salt marshes, seagrass beds, and mangroves. Much of Alex's research also incorporates kind of diverse, holistic data types into conservation and restoration. Today, Alex will be speaking to us about holistic restoration, incorporating science and culture into wetland conservation practices. So Alex, we are so excited to have you here today and to learn from you. And without further ado, everyone please help me in welcoming Dr. Alex Moore.
All right, thank you, both for the introduction that I didn't hear because I was panicking about screens, and also thank you all for being here. I think it's all set now. I just turned it on. So much is happening.
Did you want to do slide advance?
I mean, I can also just press this button. Everything's
Okay.
at my fingertip. Cool. Okay, as I was saying, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. And thank you all for being here, both in person and virtual. As was just mentioned, I think, my name's Alex. I did go to school here, so I did both my undergrad and my master's, so I left in 2013. So it's pretty special for me to be back here chatting with you all about my research. So the topic for today is holistic restoration, thinking about how do you incorporate science into and culture into conservation practice. Okay, so I will just go ahead and get started. I'll press this. So I think what will help us get started today, one, I think I will say, relative to the other talks, mine will be a bit broad. So I'm going to spend the first half, I think, talking a little bit about ecology as the science specific, and then I'll fold in some of the social elements towards the end of today, so just so you have a sense for how this is organized. And so in terms of setting the stage, I think it's important to define restoration. So the Society for Ecological Restoration defines restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And so I'll show a quick example of what that might look like. So this comes direct from the SER website, where you're really seeing the process of restoration happen, or at least the outcomes of several stages of restoration, right? So you have a degraded ecosystem up in this 2008 panel, and you see this process of restoration ending with this sort of healthy, recovered-looking state in this 2011 panel. And so I will do one really quick interactive part of today. So I'm going to ask a quick question, and you'll just raise your hand if you think the answer to the question is what it is. And so the question that I have is, just by show of hands, how many of you think that most restoration efforts are successful? So they're sort of meeting the goals that are established. Would you raise your hand and say, yeah, I think most of them are successful? Not one hand is up. Okay, great. A pessimist crowd. But you're not wrong. So most restoration efforts actually don't meet their stated goals. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, which I won't get into today, but I will just sort of start by saying that my focus is really thinking about if we take a holistic approach to restoration, which I will explain later, we might be able to do a better job at recovering services and getting systems back to sort of a healthy state. And so there are widespread examples that indicate that we're not doing a great job at restoration. So these are just 4 random papers that are talking about a variety of different ecosystems. So you've got wetlands referenced here, you've got tropical forests, you've got river systems. So there's a variety of different kinds of systems where we're doing this work, but we're really not getting the outcomes that we're hoping for. And as is true for most things in ecology, there's a lot of explanations for why this might be the case. And what I think is important, again, is really to think about these as a whole system. And because my work focuses on wetland systems, I'm actually just going to hone in on that as the example for today, but you can really think of applications across a variety of different kinds of systems. All right, so what I'm showing you here is a map of the global distribution of wetlands. So the green represents the wetlands themselves, and then the blue represents inland bodies of water. And as you can see, wetlands are found on nearly every continent on the planet, but it turns out that their boundaries and their definitions are actually quite broad. So if you say that you work in a wetland, that could mean anything, like effectively anything. And so what I do in my work to really try to narrow that focus down a bit is by saying that I work in coastal wetland systems. And those you can group roughly into these three categories. You've got salt marshes, mangrove forests, and seagrass beds, which are found in tropical and subtropical regions across the globe. They make up only 1% of the Earth's total surface area, but despite that they only take up that small amount of space, they do provide numerous functions and services disproportionate to their size. So a handful of those are listed here. So you've got being really important biodiversity hotspots. They perform a number of different services to mitigate climate change impacts. They provide food and water resources for both local and regional communities. And then lastly, they're really robust recreation and tourism economies associated with these ecosystems. So they are incredibly important across a variety of different kinds of facets. So thinking about the kinds of ways that you might value something, wetlands, especially coastal wetlands, fall into many of those different categories. All right, so despite the fact that I just said that they're really important, knowing that something's valuable, that it is really important, doesn't necessarily mean that we do a great job of taking care of it. And so they are among, coastal wetlands in particular, are among the most threatened ecosystems across the globe. And so what I'm showing you here are 4 examples of the human drivers of the losses and decline of coastal systems globally. And so this includes, here I'll point at each of them, land conversion, so taking something that once was a wetland and converting it into something else, typically aquaculture, depending on where you are, but also urban development. Timber resources, so harvesting and deforestation. This is really specific to mangrove forests, but that is a really big reason that you see decline in that kind of ecosystem. The crabs here are really just meant to indicate that the removal of certain species from that ecosystem can have these cascading effects that lead to the whole-scale loss of function and health across the environment. And then the last one here is climate change and the associated sea level rise. So given that they are positioned along the coast, you would expect that they would have really direct negative impacts due to sea level changes. Now, because we know that they're important, we also know that they're in decline globally, there are really significant restoration efforts ongoing to help improve the conditions of these systems across the globe. And so similar to the example that I provided earlier, the goal of restoration is to take something that looks like this. So this is a degraded, largely unhealthy wetland ecosystem, and then to turn it into something that looks a bit like this. And so these are just sort of visual examples. So I can't speak to the health necessarily, but we can get a sense of what a before and after might look like for a successful restoration effort. And so as we have established as a group, most efforts don't really go quite this way, right? We don't really get the kind of recovery and health that we're looking for. And for wetlands in particular, what we know is that biodiversity and ecosystem processes are reduced in restored wetlands by about 33%. And so we're comparing a restored wetland to a healthy reference wetland, and we're seeing that there's that gap of about 33% between how the restored wetland is performing relative to that healthy system. And so there are a number of known reasons for this, right? So how big was the wetland? How long has it been since restoration has occurred? Is there environmental context that's really important? Are the climate differences? So that list can go on and on. But something that I think is really important that we don't see interrogated all that often is really just the way that we do restoration in the first place. Like, we're not really critical about that component. And so what I want to do is just show you what that looks like across the board, and then dive into things that I think we could be doing differently. And so I will start by saying that no 2 restoration efforts are exactly alike. There are a number of different reasons for the degradation of a habitat, and then a number of different things that might be needed to recover it. But most restoration efforts have these 3 elements to it that really form the foundation of the effort. So the first one is to address whatever the degrading factor is in the first place. So whatever's causing the degradation of that space, deal with that, because anything else you do beyond that is really useless. The next step is really to do what we say is sort of rehabilitate the soil and improve the hydrology. So make sure you've got improved soil quality, make sure the water is flowing properly through the system. These are really important physical elements of these ecosystems. And then the last element here is, again, to restore the vegetation. And so the goal here is really to improve the physical structure, so provide habitat, provide a direct resource for species that might come back into that ecosystem, and then improve services and and function as a result of their presence. And so as you can see here, we're really focusing, if we sort of categorize things, mostly on physical features, right? So we're making sure that the physical structures are in place and that the assumption here is that species will return, health and function will return as a result. But I think most of everyone here would agree that environments are more than just their physical factors, right? An ecosystem is more than just the vegetation that's a part of that system. And so it might be that there are a lot of different variables and factors not being considered in restoration that might help with recovery. And so what I'm going to do is really go through what I think are two important elements that are not often considered that I think would be really important to start thinking about. The first one, from an ecological perspective, is really recognizing the role of species, right? Recognizing what are the different species that might be present within these ecosystems and what do they do within those environments. So beyond planting vegetation, we have to recognize that these different species present in these ecosystems do certain things that might influence the level of function and health of these ecosystems. And so it might be important for us to include them in restoration efforts to get additional recovery beyond just having planted vegetation across the system. And we do have evidence to suggest that these considerations are important. And so what I'm showing you here in this first panel is a paper that came out in 2016 where the authors were really trying to understand the various impacts that herbivore species might have on plant reproduction and plant growth. And so just to walk you through, what they're looking at is a number of different herbivores. So they're listed here with different shapes and colors. And then they're measuring different features of the plant. So survival, density, reproduction, cover, height, below ground biomass, above ground biomass. And then the 0 dotted line is really an indication that the plants aren't, or the herbivores aren't doing anything, and then values above and value below indicate that they're having some sort of positive or negative impact on whatever feature is being evaluated. And so just looking at this figure, across the board, we can see largely that these species are having an impact, right? It might be negative, it might be positive. There's very few 0, the ones that fall right on the 0 line. So we're realizing that these are species that play a particular role that influence plants, which we then have to assume means that they're influencing other features within the ecosystems that are associated with plants. So that's one very specific way to look at it. In my own work, so this is a paper that came out just last year that I worked on with my PhD advisor, this one was really trying to scale this up. And so this first study focused on just the presence or absence of these consumers. And then in this study, what we did was really tried to understand the role that predators might play also within these systems. And so this adds in that extra layer, trying to understand what about interactions between species, how might that further influence different impacts in the system. You don't have to get into all the details of what's being measured here, but what I will say is that, so what we looked at was one particular variable at a field site, and we manipulated the presence or absence of a predator species across different plots within these different field sites. And so the first thing that I'll highlight is this one, which is the control conditions at the site. So we did no manipulations. The assumption here is that there's a robust predator population, so it's performing expected services or functions. And then in the treatments where we had the predator removed, we saw a reduction in that particular feature that we're measuring across these sites. So we're saying that the absence of the predator is somehow influencing this particular feature. And then in the plots where we had the predator explicitly included, we're seeing that this particular function is now sort of recovering in some respect, right? We're getting closer to what it was like in conditions where the predator was initially present here. And so we take this to mean that there's evidence that suggests that the role of predators and also thinking about the interactions between predators and their prey are influencing certain levels of functions across these wetland sites, and that is important. That's important information that could be really helpful to inform the way that we do this kind of work. And so what I think all of this means collectively is that we have to rethink our approaches to restoration. So we really shouldn't be thinking about this only in terms of the physical elements, which we still need, right? So I'm not saying scrap that. We definitely still need it. But I think it's important to think beyond that and consider the role that rewilding and adding other essentially really important species across these spaces, how that might help us do a better job of getting the kind of recovery that we're hoping for across these landscapes. Okay, I'm gonna take a quick drink of water. Okay, so this has all been about sort of that first thing. So I said that there are two things that I'm really interested in my work to try to help us improve recovery within the restoration work that we do. The first one was thinking about the role of species. The second one is trying to think about the role of local communities and the role of culture in informing how people interact with and influence ecosystems that they live nearby. And so some examples of cultural values include things like having traditional uses and cultural heritage really tightly associated with certain landscapes, thinking about subsistence fishing, subsistence hunting practices, spiritual values of sacred spaces or species. All of these things are really important to local communities and can inform the ways that they use and interact with their ecosystems. And so beyond the science, and even here today we're talking about really specific Western science, we really have to think about other kinds of knowledge systems and other ways that people interact with their landscapes to really help us better understand how those systems function and how we can do a better job of managing them and of maintaining them over time. And there are a lot of papers that have come out. So these are just 4 papers from the past 7 to 10 years that are really trying to acknowledge the importance of considering local community values, their cultural heritage, and how those things are tightly associated with the ways they engage with landscapes and how that can really inform conservation practice. And so it's important to note, too, that even though all these papers are coming out, we're not seeing an attendant change in conservation practice, right? So we have information that suggests that these things are really important. And so the goal is really to try to take that and translate it into change on the ground in terms of how we do the work that we're doing. And so in my work, I'm really interested in trying to understand the role that culture plays within these different practices for managing landscapes and managing ecosystems, and also engaging directly with local communities in that process. And so what I'm showing you here is an example of a paper that has been in review forever, but is now finally in press. So this should be coming out pretty soon. But I worked on this with a couple of student mentees. And our goal was really to ask a simple question. So what are the different cultural values associated with mangrove ecosystems? Like, what do we know? What are the papers that exist out there on this topic? And how can we summarize that information? And so what this map is really to show you what we saw in terms of the spread of that information. So across the tropics, where you can see the outline of these different countries, all of the areas sort of wrapped in green. So these are areas, global areas of mangrove presence. So these are areas that have been mapped. This data is from 2018, I want to say that. So, and that has likely changed a bit since then, but this is sort of the standard that is, I think, a useful reference. And then the different circles on this map with labeled regions are meant to represent the number of papers that we found published on cultural services associated with mangroves in that area. And so the yellow circle means that we saw 1 to 4 papers. The blue circle means that we saw 5 to 10 papers, 5 to 9. I'm missing the ends here a little bit. And then the red circle indicates that we saw more than 10, but always less than 20. So we didn't see anything published in any area that was ever more than 20 papers on a particular topic. And so I think there's a really glaring takeaway here, which is that there's a lot of sort of bias in where we're doing this work, right? So Southeast Asia has the largest portion of mangroves left in the world, so it makes sense that you would see a lot of studies in that area. But there are still mangroves everywhere else. So, and we're missing those areas in terms of trying to understand what are the cultural values and uses associated with those landscapes. And I think it's safe to assume that without having that data, we clearly can't be using it in conservation, right? So we're not really asking questions, we're not really communicating with the right communities of people to then help inform how these landscapes are managed. And I think it's important to recognize that there are some really significant and measurable consequences to not incorporating local people into this kind of work. And so this is a paper that came out by a handful of colleagues. No, I don't know any of them. A handful of researchers from 2021. And what they did was they went to collect as many papers as they could that evaluated conservation outcomes, and they measured their outcomes in terms of both some more traditional ecosystem metrics, so think about biodiversity, think about nutrients, and they also measured it in terms of the well-being of the local communities in those areas. And they measured those outcomes relative to who controlled the work. So was it controlled by external factors, so think about large-scale NGOs, or was it controlled by local communities? And so I won't go through all of them, but so these are the outcomes that they were looking at. So were the outcomes positive for both well-being, so human well-being, and also conservation? Were the outcomes negative for well-being and conservation? And then there are these trade-offs and other sort of more complex outcomes that might be present. And then across the top, we're looking again at, was that work controlled externally? And then was that work controlled locally with invested interest with local communities really leading that work? And in terms of outcomes, what we saw, and I'll only go over these first two, is for externally controlled work, the proportion of the papers that they found that had positive outcomes for both conservation and people was only 15% of those papers. Whereas for work that was locally controlled, their conservation outcomes were positive for both well-being and the ecosystem in more than half of those efforts. So that's a pretty big implication, I think, in terms of who should be in control of this kind of work. And then we can see the negative outcomes. So this is, again, negative for both well-being and conservation. And that was a big section of the externally controlled work, right? So 34% of the papers that they found had negative outcomes for both conservation and human well-being if it was controlled by external actors. Whereas a very, very small portion of that was true for locally controlled work, so only 3.4%. So that means a lot, I think. I think that this really is a telling narrative about who should be in control of this work. And I think it also is one of those things that tells us that we should be, once again, rethinking how we approach conservation, how we approach restoration. And so at the beginning, I talked about this in terms of the physical elements and also adding in more of these ecological components. And that's, again, focusing on the system and not really thinking about the people. And so I think that we also have to add that in. So the local values, the local uses, and people who are in those areas being in control of that work, it really needs to be incorporated into these efforts in order to improve outcomes. And it's all of this together that I mean when I say holistic conservation, holistic restoration, really thinking about the whole picture, as opposed to just focusing on small, discrete parts because it's easier, but it's less realistic, and it's also more harmful. Okay, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm gonna assume I'm doing okay. So I've got just a couple slides left. So in saying this, I do want to point out a really important point, because I think it's maybe nuanced and hard to get at it unless you say it explicitly. But these efforts have to be non-extractive, right? They have to be inclusive. They have to be reciprocal. And the reason for that, besides just trying to be a good person, is that conservation has a really, really awful colonial and exploitative history that has disproportionately harmed indigenous communities and other communities of color. And those historical practices are still present in how we do it today, right? So we can't talk about these as sort of historical legacies that are no longer present. They're very present in how we do conservation. And I think that's evident in what I showed you on the previous slide, but it's also true in just the practices on the ground. So two of the most common approaches to conservation today are what's called fortress conservation, right? So you take a green space, you basically put an invisible gate around it, and you prevent people from accessing the resources that are within those spaces and prevent them from engaging and interacting with landscapes that are probably really important both to their livelihoods, but also to their cultural heritage and to other different histories that are really important to those communities. And that's a really big practice today, right? Just sort of locking off a landscape and saying you can't access it anymore. The other practice is one that's called really green militarization. There are a couple different types of terms for this. And the goal here is to really arm communities of people to then protect species and protect spaces. And that, I think, is just pretty explicit in the problems that can arise from really pitting people against resources, right? And I think that that's a really problematic approach that also tends to be really reminiscent of very triggering and harmful histories that are just being replicated again today. And so these two practices are big on the list of how we do conservation today, and this can lead to lots of really significant conflict between communities of people, and then have negative outcomes that are true for both the people and the ecosystems, right? So the goals that you're trying to do and accomplish are not being accomplished with the approaches that you're taking. And so in thinking about ways to practice just and inclusive and equitable and all the words we say all the time, conservation, I like to actually use this framework that Anne Toomey wrote about in a paper that came out in 2016, where she talks about these spaces of encounter. And so I don't know if you're super familiar with this, but I'm just going to go through it really quickly. In this paper, Toomey, I do know her. So Anne Toomey talks about the ways that we as researchers or practitioners engage with and interact with local communities, and really think about like interrogating the role that we play in those encounters. And so in the paper, she talks, I think, about 8 different spaces in which you might come across communities in your work, but I'm only going to highlight 5 of them because I think they might be most relevant to those of you here today, after I drink one more sip. So the first one is thinking about the spaces of arriving and getting permission, right? So who are you asking for permission to do the work? Are you asking a government agency? Are you asking an institution? Are you not asking the family who lives nearby that area and you have to go through their backyard or into their area to use those resources? That matters a lot, right? So who you talk to, who you get permission from, how does that influence the ways that you interact with those communities? And how does that also relate to previous histories those communities have had with researchers are really important questions to ask. The next one is thinking about local labor. So who are you hiring to help you with your work? Oftentimes, it's important to include local labor, right? I wouldn't dissuade you from doing that. But depending on who you talk to, you might be reinforcing different power dynamics that are already present within those communities. So thinking about who's being excluded from being able to participate in this kind of work and who's benefiting from it and who's not in those local communities is really important. The next one is knowledge exchange. And I think this is one that, I mean, all of these we're all guilty of, but I think this is a really big one, especially from sort of a scientific research community, is when you enter a space and assume you know more, right? So you're either giving the information to people or you're extracting information and then leaving, right? And so both of those are problematic, two sides of the same kind of problematic coin. So recognizing that knowledge exchange should be bi-directional, or in terms of however many parties are involved, it shouldn't be one in which you are taking from someone else or anyone is explicitly taking from you. The fourth one is relevance, and this one I think is the tricky one for a lot of people. You have your research question, right? Does your research question matter to the community of people that you are working around or working with? And so recognizing the relevance of the questions you're asking is really important. And so sometimes it might be important to shift what your question is to really meet certain needs that communities themselves can't meet, but you have the capacity to help them with. And so that relevance point is actually going to be really important, I think, in a lot of ways that people develop their projects. And then the last one here is just analysis and acknowledgement. And this one might be the lowest hanging fruit on this list. So if you are being supported by local communities in the work that you're doing, give them acknowledgement in your papers, right? So you might be an author. Can they be an author? Can they be acknowledged in the paper? I think oftentimes local communities know that they provided a lot of assistance and a lot of knowledge, and they don't see that recognized anywhere. And so that can lead to really disruptive and problematic relationships within communities moving forward. So those are the 5 that I wanted to talk about today, but I definitely recommend reading the paper to get the sense for the other ones that were talked about. And so I'll just end here by saying that there are a lot of different ways that you can try to approach doing inclusive and equitable conservation. I think that what matters from the very top is to have meaningful participation in the work that you're doing. So it's not being driven and led only by scientists or your colleagues, but really engaging in the various knowledge systems and different histories that people might have in relationship to their landscapes in the work that you're doing. Again, consideration of these spaces of encounter is just a starting point, right? We're not saying that like once you do those things, you're like a perfect researcher, because that's not true. But it is a good place, I think, to start for people who are really concerned about these things, but often don't know where to start. So I think that that is a good place to start. Again, knowledge exchange and the co-creation of policies and practices. So again, to avoid entering spaces and trying to tell people how things should be done. And then again, taking a holistic approach, so serving both nature and people in the work that you're doing. And I recognize that this makes things a lot more complicated, but it also makes things more realistic. And I think it's in our best interest to engage in ways that will lead to sustainable and positive outcomes for all parties involved. And I think that's all the time I have. And so I actually like to end with just a quick page of resources, because I know that a talk like this, even if I had a whole hour, it would have been impossible to go through it. So here's just a slide of some things that I have found really useful in sort of shaping my thinking. And so I hope that you all feel similarly about it. So that's all I've got. Thank you all. Looking forward to chatting.
So there's a question in Zoom that I can read.
Do you want to go ahead and do that?
So the question is, local success versus external control failure implies a high value to indigenous knowledge. Do you agree? And how best to harness and reward this?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
No worries. Local success versus external control failure implies a high value to indigenous knowledge. Do you agree with that statement?
Okay.
And how best to harness and reward this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer to that is a lot of this slide. So indigenous knowledge is very important and should be valued at the same way that you value your own research, right? I think that it's silly that we think about these things as hierarchical and one is better than the other. And so I think that in saying that the level of success that we get from locally controlled work is due to valuing indigenous knowledge highly, I think is correct, because I think that's what we should be doing. And then the other part was about something I've already forgotten. Oh, how do we do it, like work with it? Again, I think it means this. And so it's one of those things that you have to be careful about, right? So you don't want to enter into a space and say, give me your indigenous knowledge, because it will help improve these things. All of this requires relationship building, right? I think you have to be able to give the time to build connection with people and to build connection with communities so that they can feel safe with you there doing this work and sharing the labor of this work with them. So that is my shorthand answer to a very complicated question. Anything else?
Anyone in the room have any questions?
I'm not offended if the answer is no. We can just move on to the next thing.
Well, maybe we're due for a break now, right? And maybe during the break, people can think of questions. And right now, I think maybe everybody's tired, Alex. And when we all come back for the panel discussion, maybe some questions will emerge at that point. Okay? So let's thank Alex again.